Hello and welcome to Fast Not Good, where we make videos fast and not good. We are still in France, recording on Jack's Mac, so please forgive the audio quality, but we still want to contribute to the discourse! As Ethel threatened in our last video, we've got some thoughts to share about the presentation of death in Severance. Following a creative symposium, that is, a couple of days scribbling notes and checking episode transcripts and going on interesting chat tangents, there's actually a bunch we'd like to discuss, and it won't fit in one video. We're not ContraPoints or H-Bomber Guy yet. Bite-sized chunks for now. So this is video 1 of probably 5 on the theme of death in Severance. This video will primarily examine Gemma's death and Mark's avoidant style of grieving before probing some potential theories about what might be going on with Gemma. The following videos in this mini-series will cover PT's death, severed employees retiring from or leaving Lumon, the innie's conceptualizations of death, concluding with a video about immortality. We'll make them when we feel like it. Overall, deaths in Severance fit into one of two categories: the Thanatophobic or death avoidant category, and the immortal or death transcendent category. We're going to start with the exception, because there's fully one exception who doesn't fit into either of those boxes. Grainer. Rip. Bludgeoned to bits and then just not mentioned again. Well, he's mentioned twice. Kobel says to Milchik that
Mr. Grainer sits with Kier now.
And Milchik mentions Grainer retiring to Mark.
Oh, the stress at Mr. Grainer. Retiring and everything.
And that's it. Theories are circulating about the man in the hallway here in Season 2, Episode 1, but IMDb credits a different actor who will apparently be a recurring character, so yeah. Grainer dies and is dead, as far as we can tell. Everyone else, and all other discussions around death and dying, can be categorised into the Thanatophobic group, featuring characters who are presented as dead but not really, or sort of dead but it's wiggly, and the Immortals group, who are somehow death transcendent. Section the first! The Thanatophobic group. Sociologists have labelled modern Western culture as thanatophobic. That is, anxious about, or outright afraid of, death and the process of dying. Grief counsellor and author Stephen Jenkinson notes how
people in any culture inherit their understandings of dying much more than they create them. In our case, that inheritance takes the form of an extraordinary degree of aversion to and dread of dying. My phrase for it was that the culture is incontrovertibly and, for the most part, unconsciously death-phobic.
The French historian Philippe Harry, who in 1974 published a study on the history of Western attitudes to death, wrote about the contemporary horror of death and our violent attachment to the things of life. Severance as a show seems to be indulging this holding on, this violent attachment, in not allowing certain important characters to simply die, in disallowing death. She's alive! This is endemic in a bunch of Western popular media. Writers often provide a plot armour, an indestructibility to their protagonists, putting characters into dangerous, death-brushing situations, but still letting viewers relax into their escapism in the confidence that their beloved screen friends will be okay in the end. This is part of why Game of Thrones was so shocking. Protagonists really died, and this absence of a safety net is perhaps what made the show's early seasons so compelling. But aside from Grainer, who we're 95% sure is dead, there are question marks and what-ifs abound in Severance. For other dead characters, Gemma, PT, and under different theoretical lenses, Kier and the Egans, there are conditions, speculative escape clauses, and uncertainties around the status of death. Gemma first. Well, Gemma and Mark. It doesn't take a grief counsellor to deduce that outie Mark's behaviours are avoidant. We learn that he was hugely affected by the death of his wife, that he tried to return to his teaching job 3 weeks later.
It was a disaster.
That he opted for severance, having seen an ad in the newspaper, and that the severed job, which equips him to totally disconnect from difficult emotions for 40 hours a week.
Well, the work things helped.
Innie Mark gives the viewers a glimpse of what Mark is like when he's not bearing the raw burden of grief. Innie Mark's personality, the Mark we meet who isn't desperately sad all the time, shows traits that outie Mark, who's often an asshole, may well be capable of. Innie Mark helps us sympathise with outie Mark. Innie Mark shows empathy and self-sacrifice in abundance. He takes hits in the break room for his colleagues. He automatically and intrinsically cares about Miss Casey and presents this care as essentially human, like it's obvious.
Because we're people, not parts of people.
Unconscious of his outie's emotionally immobilizing pain, innie Mark behaves generously and compassionately. The severance procedure enabled Mark to completely step away from the emotional pain for the duration of a workday. By season 2, this is utterly compromised, as innie Mark is now acting from a position of awareness that his outie's wife has been his innie's wellness counsellor. Yikes. Anyway, outie Mark hasn't allowed himself the space to grieve. From what we know of Gemma's death, Mark couldn't experience any kind of closeness with the body, any interaction, any sufficient time frame to comprehend his loss. He identified her body. That's all the information we've got right now. Some cultures allow much more time with the deceased. An extreme-ish example is in Toraja, Indonesia, where author Caitlin Doughty met Agus. Agus's grandfather died, and his body was kept in the home for 7 years, in the same bed he slept in. He was clothed and stood against the wall in the mornings. This extended time frame gives the living a different relationship with death. Death is not a hard border. It can be transgressed. Living individuals can keep interacting with the dead person during the transition. The boundaries are smudged. Instead of a life-death binary, a spectrum emerges, where the space occupied by a dead person changes from physically present to conceptually remembered over a much longer adjustment phase. This different relationship with a person's dead body may seem morbid to folks raised in Western cultures, where death and dying processes are often concealed, literally in hospitals and hospices, and conceptually by conversational taboos. Season 2, Episode 2 tells us that Mark identified Gemma's body.
You remember I identified her, right?
Yes, Mark.
I saw her body.
Yeah, I know.
Identification in a hospital is a much faster and emotionally harsher interaction with a corpse than the Tajaran practice, or even the possibility of sitting with a coffin before burial. This is speculative, though. We haven't heard anything about the rest of the process. What happened after Mark identified the body as Gemma? Was he involved in any of the rest of the process, or did hospital administration and funerary services manage the practical matters? Had the body been burned, like in the hypothetical scenario that Mark spits at Devon in the diner? Hopefully we'll find out more as the series unfolds. But Mark hasn't allowed himself the space to grieve. Space to grieve doesn't mean emotional immobility. It doesn't mean wallowing. It also means meaningful tasks. Drawing on death practices from many cultures, Doughty cites these examples.
Using chopsticks to methodically clutch bone after bone and place them in an urn. Building an altar to invite a spirit to visit once a year. Even taking a body from the grave to clean and redress it. These activities give the mourner a sense of purpose. A sense of purpose helps the mourner grieve. Grieving helps the mourner begin to heal.
Mark was rendered purposeless by Gemma's death. Unable to return to teaching, he chose a severed job, where he consciously shut off his selfhood and emotions for 8 hours a day. The rest of his time looks to be preoccupied with diversions and distractions and self-numbing. These strategies seem innate and comfortable, as they would from 2 years of building the habits. The practical outcome of all of this is that Mark's severance has allowed him, if my maths is correct, only 67% of the conscious grieving time that he might have had without the severance chip.
Does he ever talk about her?
Not as much as I'd wish.
Mark refuses to address his grief. He does all he can to avoid it.
This is obscene.
I just want to be sure.
I am sure.
Mark's explosive reaction to Devon in the diner shows the viewers Mark's sensitivity when his avoidance tactic is confronted, and his defensiveness around the topic of Gemma's death. Mark seems totally unwilling to contemplate the possibility that Gemma isn't dead, whilst also unwilling or unable to grieve healthily. Like, he's not ready to move past his bleak emotional stasis. He's grown comfortable occupying his position as a bereaved individual, comfortable with the numbing behaviours, and desperately uncomfortable with clambering out of his despair pit. Talking about Gemma requires Mark to acknowledge that she's really gone. We see a glimmer of this after Alexa leaves, though Mark seems quick to disengage from this emotional turmoil. Devon asking Mark to entertain the possibility of Gemma not being dead stirs up a different hurricane of emotional turmoil. For Mark, a character who's grown accustomed to emotional stagnation, both of these options Gemma's death and Gemma's ongoing life are impossibly alien and too painful to bear. It's like he's claiming a monopoly, like he's the only one allowed to feel anything about Gemma dying, and he does feel a lot. But it's like, in her death, Mark can only think of Gemma as his wife. The multiplicity of her other connections, as a family member, as Devon's friend, as Rickon's friend, as a teacher to her students, isn't really conceivable for Mark. His wife is dead, and only his wife is dead. Devon's friend doesn't matter because Mark's wife is dead. And outie Mark's identity totally revolves around his dead wife. The possibility of Gemma being alive is therefore an attack on Mark's very identity.
Who are you?
So, if Gemma's not dead after all, Mark's last couple of years were kind of for nothing. If the show is planning to restore Gemma, all of Mark's pain in response to her death was a massive emotional drain. For nothing. Mark's severance was for nothing.
There'll be no honeymoon ending for you.
So I hope the show doesn't give us a honeymoon reunion. I hope we're going in a more interesting direction, because the possibility of a Gemma restored, a miraculous return of the person Mark loved, feels unsatisfying. I hope the show explores a different avenue, addressing the question of what has been lost and what remains. From what we've met of Miss Casey, Gemma's body is still functional. I'm choosing to ignore cloning theories, partly because I don't think they're interesting, partly because the cast has said a flat no to these speculations.
This sounds like what Lumon would be doing in like a super boring version of Severance.
You are very far off and wrong. Bing, ging gong.
So it's Gemma's body, and it's functional. She can walk and converse and understand things to an unknown degree. It does appear, though, that Gemma is gone. When people die, the absence itself becomes a presence.
Are you really in the ground? 'Cause I feel you all around me. Are you here?
Did your sheets smell like her for weeks afterwards?
We see Gemma's belongings, hidden in boxes in the basement, but still physically there. The picture kept in a box. Avoided and unavoidable.
I miss you. You never leave my mind. So much of you is left behind.
Absent and present. Shipper Hughes writes about how the deceased are uncanny. They inhabit rooms, closets, attics and clothing.
You took my life with you.
Gemma's absence is omnipresent in outie Mark's life. For the viewers watching innie Mark interacting with Miss Casey, the presence of Gemma's absence, as in her physical presence stripped of the vibrant personality described by Devon, Rickon and outie Mark, creates a uniquely fascinating situation. Severance is presenting a chilling and literal manifestation of absence as presence. Gemma the person, the pragmatic Russian literature professor, Mark's wonderful wife who made him wonderful, seems to be gone. Gemma's body is present and animated and uncanny. Where outie Mark suffers the suffocating presence of Gemma's absence, innie Mark, in a cruel dramatic irony, is himself contextually absent, and so unaware of the simultaneous experience of both the absence of Gemma's presence and the physical presence of Gemma's absence, embodied by Miss Casey on the severed floor. Questions are raised about the extent of Gemma's personality erasure. Milchick comments that
You know it's good, right? That they don't remember each other.
he's not making a comment on a one-way thing. It's not good that Mark doesn't recognise Gemma, it's good that they don't recognise each other, potentially implying that Gemma's not all gone. But precisely what is gone, and precisely what remains, is uncertain. Mark is back at work, and his allocated file is entitled Cold Harbour. A frame at the end of Season 2, Episode 1 shows Miss Casey's face on the screen. This happens super quickly, so here we go in slow motion. We zoom in on Mark's familiar MDR number soup, and we zoom out on a different screen. This monitor looks more like the staff monitors, like the ones in the management offices or the security office. This isn't Mark's computer anymore. We're seeing Mark's refinement work push a progress bar, currently at 68% complete, on someone else's monitor. And it looks pretty dang plausible that the Cold Harbour file is connected to Gemma. The management team expressed urgency about getting Mark, specifically, back to work, to complete the Cold Harbour file. As we still don't know what MDR is refining, we'll leave these observations here to play with. Miss Casey was a part-time employee on the severed floor. Her lifetime experience as wellness counsellor was fractured through half-hour sessions, and the longest awake time she reports is the 8-hour day watching Helly. We don't know how much real time elapsed around Miss Casey's fractured experience of time. We don't know for certain that she is severed. All severed employees carry lanyards. Miss Casey doesn't. All severed employees retain a slice of their outie's name. Miss Casey is a multi-stage abstraction of Gemma Scout. All severed employees are listed by name in the security office. There isn't a Gemma on that list. If I had to pick a speculation thread at this stage, partly informed by hope, I don't think she's an artificial intelligence. I certainly don't think she's a hologram. I think Gemma has undertaken a procedure that's similar to Severance, but not the same, that's rendered her residential at Lumon. I don't think there's an outie left, whatever Milchick says. Questions remain about how Lumon physically got her, about the details of the car crash, the body Mark identified, etc., etc. But yeah, Miss Casey is the body of Mark's wife Gemma. Mark's wife Gemma is functionally dead. Gemma's body somehow ended up on the testing floor, and a procedure other than Severance has created Miss Casey. That's as far as I've got. This has been an examination into one example of Severance the TV series showing Western cultural thanatophobia, or at least death aversion. Death, in real life, is an ending. It's final. In this mortal physical realm, death means it's over. Death, for Gemma and others in Severance, is a question mark. This question mark is a nice squiggly segue route into a discussion around PT. We'll make that video when we feel like it. Thanks for watching, chat in the comments. We're still in France, bye!